Derivatives. This is just going to be an introduction, a supplement for the Intermediate Accounting to Investments chapter. So a little terminology first. A derivative, it's called this because the instrument derives its value from an underlying. And an underlying, that just means something else that has direct value. Something containing a risk that you are trying to mitigate or hedge against. So what does this mean? So an underlying, this can be the price or rate of a contract or index from which a financial derivative derives its value. It can be a security price, a foreign exchange rate, a commodity price, interest rates. Interest rates, hedging against interest rate fluctuations is very popular. Index of price rates, and it could be the price or rate of an asset or liability. Now, this is not to be confused with the actual asset or the liability. It's just the price of it and the risk from that. The derivative will be classified as an asset or a liability related to the underlying. Now, required classifications. There was a time when derivatives was used for some very unethical business practices, and that came about in the times of Enron. While Enron started as an energy company, by the time they folded, their primary business source was derivative trading, and that's where the problems began. So after the fall of Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley, additional rules were created by FASB to classify derivatives to hopefully try to prevent some of the unethical practices. There is speculative and hedging. Speculative, when you're dealing with derivatives, if it's purely for speculation, it's held purely for potential gain. For hedging, this is more long-term, can be current, but more long-term, looking at risk mitigation. So hedging, use of derivatives can be ethical business practices because as a business, you want to mitigate your risk. Now, held purely for potential gain, think of day trading. I'm going to buy it this morning. I know there's going to be fluctuation. I'm going to sell it this afternoon. I want a quick gain. Gains and losses are immediate. It's recognized in earnings, not other comprehensive income. These are the new rules according to the classification. For hedging, treatment of gains and losses, it depends on the type of hedge. Some of it will go into earnings. Some of it will go into other comprehensive income. Primarily what Enron was involved in was the speculative derivative trading markets. They became very famous for very elaborative derivative trading schemes. And a lot of people lost money because of that. For hedging, though, if you use derivatives to hedge, this is risk mitigation. It is not a risk elimination. That's the key. You're not getting rid of risk. You're managing your risk. So hedging. Derivatives are inherently extremely risky. Derivative trading will increase your risk, but risk mitigation can be a good thing. Effective hedging is considered good risk. So what is hedging? You want to take an opposite risk position of the underlying investment being hedged. So just a simple explanation of this. Let's say you have an investment and you're expecting a 20% loss. So before the maturity, you invest in a derivative that is estimated to have a 20% gain. You've offset one. The goal of hedging, effective hedging, is to reach zero. You've completely offset that 20% expected loss with a 20% gain. That is hedging. That is hedge effectiveness. Any loss from the underlying hedged instrument will be perfectly offset by any gain from the associated derivative. And the new rules since Enron for accounting for derivatives, not only do you have to classify it as speculative and hedging, you have to test the effectiveness of your hedge and report and disclose it. So common derivatives, a futures contract, forwards contracts, options, stock options, interest rate swaps, very popular. And this narrator has worked with interest rate swaps, and there are many other types of derivatives. Futures contracts will have a fair value risk. Forward contracts will have a cash flow risk. Options will have a foreign currency risk, and of that foreign currency risk, it can be a fair value risk or a cash flow risk. These are the things that make accounting for derivatives difficult, because you have to consider all these components and disclose everything. So first, what is a futures contract? It may be for a commodity or a financial instrument. The investor enters into contract to purchase an instrument or commodity in the future at a price set today. So I'm going to enter into a contract. There's something I'm going to buy. In the future, I'm going to say at this date, 30 days from now, for example, I'm going to buy it, but I get to set the price today. Problem is, the price 30 days from now may not be the price that you set today. So you could have a gain or a loss. If the price goes up, you're locked in at the lower price, resulting in a gain. If the price goes down, this results in a loss that you would report. This is a fair value risk. Futures contract, the investor is required to complete the sale at an unspecified future date. The price of the future sale is fixed today. So commodity futures, this can be gold, soybean, hog belly futures. Financial futures can be for treasury bonds, treasury bills, commercial paper, CDs. Forwards contracts, it's similar to a futures contract, except the date is specifically set. Now, what about options? It's exactly the same as a futures contract, except the investor is not obligated to complete the sale. It's an option. The investor has the option to exercise at the price determined at the inception of the contract. Of course, they paid a fee for that option. The decision is based on market conditions. Now, this was written with an older textbook. This chapter 19 may not comply. This was for a McGraw-Hill textbook. For interest rate swaps, this is the most common type of derivative that many companies will enter into. Approximately 70% of all derivatives are on the market today are interest rate swaps. So what is this? What am I swapping out? You're swapping a fixed rate for a variable or a variable for a fixed. Now, the key to know there, the original interest and loan agreement does not change. That is your underlying. If you have a variable interest rate on, let's say, a long-term mortgage, you've entered into a huge mortgage for a new manufacturing plant you built, and it has a variable interest rate, and the economy's not looking very good long-term, the forecast. So you enter into a fixed interest rate swap, so you have two different instruments. You don't get rid of the original, you're just hedging against what is felt to be probable loss in the future, because the word is that variable interest rate is going to rise, so you hedge it with a fixed interest rate swap to offset your risk. You've entered into another agreement. It's not to be confused with refinancing. The underlying asset or liability never actually changes hands. That's the hard concept here. Doing this is all on paper, and then there's extra payments because of that swap. The interest payments are still made to the same financial institution, the same entity. On the other side of the transaction, the interest revenue is still recorded. There's no change. Any gain or loss associated with this derivative is paid to or received from a third party, because you've entered into an interest rate swap with possibly a different bank. So why enter into an additional obligation? Because your goal is effective hedging of the underlying instrument that will completely offset any potential loss. The gain on one side will exactly zero out the loss on the other side, or you hope it will. If it's 100% effective, then it will zero it out. It may or may not be 100% effective, but that's where the disclosure requirements. You need to disclose how effective your hedging is. This is risk mitigation working the way it was intended. Now understand, derivatives are risky. It may not work out. It may not be effective hedging. So what are the new FASB rules since Enron? Well, FASB requires disclosure of use of derivative instruments. You have to classify, is it speculative or are you hedging? And of course, the auditors will look for evidence of that, of your classification, that it's justified. FASB requires classifying as to the types of risk being hedged. You have to disclose, am I trying to hedge a fair value risk or a cash flow risk? They require testing of hedge effectiveness to be done at least every 3 months with reclassification to speculative if it's determined to be highly ineffective. Now, you can be ineffective throughout the year, but long term, if it's ineffective, then you have to reclassify. Foreign currency risk. Accounting methods will vary based on risk determination and purpose of the investment. Most multinational companies now do actively use risk mitigation for their foreign currency. Now, make sure you understand the distinction between foreign currency transactions and foreign currency translation. It's a different thing. Net investment in foreign operations will be included in other comprehensive income. Those are your unrealized gains and losses from foreign currency translation, not foreign currency transaction. Translation is simply translating it from a foreign currency to US dollars to report under GAAP. A transaction is foreign currency transaction gains or losses. Those are always just included in earnings. That is, if I have a purchase of merchandise today for $100, it's in my accounts payable. But then by the time I pay it 30 days from now, foreign currency has fluctuated, so I owe more or less than that 100. That's the gain or loss. That's immediately in earnings. Only the unrealized gains and loss from the translation go in other comprehensive income. So other foreign currency risk, fair value risk, looking at different examples. So gains and losses for fair value risk must be immediately in earnings. If it's considered ineffective, you have to reclassify it to speculative. For cash flow risk, this goes into other comprehensive income. And again, if it's ineffective long term, it must be reclassified. And the auditors do look very closely at this. So it's moved from OCI to earnings once the underlying is settled. Disclosures, quite a few. They're detailed in SFAS 133 and 161, which can now be found in the accounting codification, accounting standards codification. The use can be speculative versus hedging. You have to disclose that. You have to disclose the risk type, fair value, cash flow, or foreign currency, and which type of foreign currency, fair value, or cash flow. The types of derivatives that you're investing in must be disclosed. Is it a forward contract? Is it a futures contract? Is it an option or an interest rate swap or other type of disclosure? Everything has to be disclosed. Derivative market remains largely unregulated, and issue the SEC to this point has failed to address. But the rules just discussed were added after the derivative trading market reached its peak in the days of Enron and the Enron collapse. And these are the two reference points. You can find other information. SFAS number 133 and number 161. You can still find the old versions of these through a Google search, but it's probably best to go through the accounting standards codification.